Thank you. First of all, thank you to everyone for coming to watch me today. It's a real pleasure to come all the way to Moscow to yell at you all about CSS. And a special thanks as well to the organisers who have been incredible in looking after us while I've been here. So, let me just introduce myself for you that don't know me. I'm a freelance web designer from the United Kingdom, and I specialise in CSS, design systems, and like large-scale projects. So what I'm going to do today is try and share with you all how I think we can scale CSS to work. So let's get cracking. So, CSS has a weird place on the web today. We've got some polarization between the CSS sucks camp and the CSS rules camp. And I empathize naturally with the CSS rules camp. And I'll explain why, because I've got a theory as to why the CSS sucks camp feel like they do. And I think it's a combination of them over-engineering CSS, and maybe not quite understanding the power that CSS gives us as a language. Sometimes they'll approach it like JavaScript, and expecting it to work in the same way, which is understandable if you write JavaScript day to day. You expect other languages, or if you're a programmer by default, you expect other languages to work like that. So what I'm going to do in this session is I'm going to tackle that first bit, and I'm going to talk to you about how we can simplify CSS to give us incredible power, while also being as low-tech as possible. And the secret sauce to this talk is not really going to talk about CSS for most of it as well. So, first thing, let's get the elephant out of the room straight away. Let's talk about scale. Scale is rubbish most of the time, and I absolutely hate it when we use the term scale in the industry. And I think we're stuck with it there. We're stuck with these weird words that we invent. So we've got serverless and Jamstack and performant. And we're stuck with them. They stick around. Every time you want to find something on the internet, you have to work with these words. And I especially hate performant because it's not even a real word. But they're all equally awful words. We can all agree with that. But one thing they do is create a common, recognizable construct for communication. And as much as it pained me, it's exactly why I named this talk Keeping It Simple with CSS that scales. Because you probably knew before I even opened my mouth that I'd be talking about large projects, large teams, complex code bases, and sites that have lots of users. And that's cool, because that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about. But one thing I get really miffed with is when people use the word scale as an excuse to over-engineer something. So I often see something like this on Twitter. We use a CSS and JS library because our product needs to scale. It's normally someone like this, and there'll be some San Francisco-based tech bro. And to me, the content that they tend to produce anyway isn't good enough to even warrant saying stuff like that. And I'll be bold and straight up and say that I don't think using scale is an excuse for over-engineering stuff, especially CSS, is acceptable, even for humongous teams working on huge projects. And I'm talking Microsoft, Google scale, like huge projects. You can still achieve them with real CSS. And keep that in mind, because I hope by the end of the session, you might be in agreement with me, or maybe not. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is I'm going to split it into 4 categories, so 4 key things. And there'll be this little progress screen, so you can see just how long you've got to endure me for. So it's not too long, don't worry. And here they are. So we've got don't panic, communicate, consistency, and simplification. I could package all this up as DCCS and really mop up the Twitter retweets, couldn't I? But I digress anyway. Let's talk first about not panicking, because this is really common. So, one of my favorite books, films, TV series is called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And a short synopsis is basically the Earth gets blown up to make space for a hyperspace highway. And then Arthur Dent, here on the right, he goes on an intergalactic hitchhike with Ford Prefect, his guide, and basically learns the meaning of life and why the Earth even exists. It's very wild, and that's a terrible synopsis, so go out and read the book. And you didn't come here to watch me talk about Hitchhiker's Guide, so let's move on. But the thing about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is it's an interactive encyclopedia. Well, interactive by 1979 standards. And what really resonates with me about this encyclopedia is that on the cover of it, it's got this, "Don't panic," in big text. And it makes me laugh because the phrase is used so many times throughout the story, even when it's very clear that the person should be panicking, you know, like being locked in a Voltron airlock. You definitely would be panicking in that context. But that's the key sort of message about the book. And I find myself really resonating with Ford Prefect was the guide, because he approaches everything that happens with this sort of pragmatism and calmness. And he does practice what he preaches when he says, "Don't panic." And in fact, when Arthur, the main character, first gets the encyclopedia handed to him, he says this, he says, "I like the cover, don't panic. It's the first helpful or intelligible thing anybody said to me all day." And that really resonates with me too. So I can see you all out there in the audience thinking, what the hell is he on about? This has got nothing to do with CSS. And don't worry, it might make sense soon, what I'm talking about. So, don't panic. It's such good advice, because when we panic, we make silly mistakes. Think about it. How many times have you made horrendous CSS hacks when you're up against it on a strict deadline and you can't, with a movable time, you've got no time left and you're panicking? In fact, let's have a bit of audience participation. Put your hand up if you ever used a CSS important when the timelines run out. I'll put my hand up. Yeah, see, plenty of hands go up. And it's absolutely fine, because when you're at the end of a deadline, and your CSS is getting a bit out of hand, you've got a specificity issue that you can't work out, of course you're going to use an important because you want to get it done. And these little hacks are fine, but they do all add up as well. Often, though, panic goes beyond a little hack here and there, and we use panic and escalate the situation into something much more serious. So often this might mean choosing a very heavy-duty framework or a sort of CSS and JS library, which can be the equivalent of taking out a payday loan to pay off your house mortgage. An incredibly high-interest technical debt, which frustratingly the developer who took it out originally doesn't have to pay it back because they've normally gone away and gone to work somewhere else by the time the product goes live. Or worse, which is more often the case, is that the user has to pay for the technical debt in the payment of low performance on their low-powered devices. And this boggles my mind when you consider what we have available to us with modern CSS. I'll have a quick digression to talk to you about the modern state of CSS, because I think we've never had it better. So, here's a chart. I love charts. I'm a big fan of charts as a designer because they show you very clearly the difference between datasets. So as you can see here, we've got display block, display flex, and display grid. And obviously, display block's got 100% support because it's CSS2 spec, so every browser supports it. But look at display flex. It's pulling in at the moment 98.8% support across all browsers. And display grid is pulling in 93% support across all browsers. So if you use these newer layout tools with a progressive enhancement mindset, your layout's just sorted, job done, nothing to worry about anymore. And we also get these cool CSS custom properties as well, CSS variables. And these are really cool for tokenizing our CSS and pulling on features that we've got from other languages where we can create variables and use them throughout our code. So in this example here, I'm just setting a primary color, which is gray, obviously, with these slides. And then I'm applying it on a box and a badge component, which gives you this. So the box has got a gray background, and the badge has got gray text. And then what we can do with CSS custom properties, because they're affected by the cascade, we can create contextual overrides for them in our CSS. So here I've got like an about page layout, and in there I'm saying, do you know what? I want my primary color to be hot pink instead of gray. So now you get to see the one and only full color slide of this presentation. You get this abomination where you've got a bright pink box and then badge written in bright pink text. And that's cool, and it's a really powerful way of creating this scalable CSS setups, because we've got all these features that we were dreaming of available to us now, and the support for custom properties is also in the high 80s, so we're looking really good for it. But CSS does come up short still, and especially when you've got lots of CSS to write. And all of this native functionality that we get, custom properties and layout, are really cool, but I still like to lean on Sass. Because let's not forget, we've got this, it's currently in discussion, CSS native nesting, which this isn't Sass, this is actual CSS, where we might be able to get CSS nesting available to us reasonably soon. And in most cases, that'd be absolutely fine, but I do have a bit of a heart attack when I think about how CSS nesting might affect low-powered devices, especially when we're already kludging up the main process with JavaScript. So we don't have to abandon Sass because native language features are coming. And it's probably better to cautiously pre-compile your CSS and not force the browser to actually work as hard. We do that with JavaScript already. We use Babel and we compile our JavaScript down into something more digestible for the browser, even when we're using ES6 in the browser too. And the browser's already working hard enough. It's re-rendering the DOM every time one piece of data changes. So that's in like reactive frameworks like React Vue, etc. So why make it work harder just so you can have native nesting with CSS? And to me, that smells a lot like developer experience being prioritized over end user experience. And we rush to throw things into the trash without thinking about the wider implications. Yeah, we'll get nesting soon, but how is this low-powered device going to handle 5 levels of chain selectors that are nested? How is this low-powered device going to handle a calculation of a CSS custom property that's been overridden several times in the cascade? It doesn't matter how good the native tools are that we get given to us. If we keep throwing rubbish code at browsers, it's the users that will suffer for it and not us ourselves as developers. And this is a mid-range Android device, which is incredibly popular, not just in the developing world, but also in the Western world, because it comes in at about £100. So these are the sort of devices people are using the web on, not high-end Android or high-end iPhones. That's us that are using the web on them. The general population tend to be using stuff like this instead. So anyway, back to Sass. The beauty of Sass is that you can have the best of both worlds. You get cool stuff like nesting, and you get variables. And if you do it right, using something like BEM, you can get nice flat selectors too. And you also get components. And if you want, and this is what I quite like to do, you can generate different bundles as well, which is really useful for like large projects. And the thing that I like the most, especially being an accessibility advocate, is that you can lint your CSS at build time, so you can test for contrast issues and stuff like that at the point of build rather than relying on the browser instead. And the most important thing with SCSS, which is like Sass, but you get this CSS syntax, is that you're still writing CSS. Because SCSS is smart enough to know that if it doesn't understand something, it should just ignore it. So that's why when CSS Custom Properties arrived, Sass just carried on working, even though it didn't know what a CSS Custom Property was, because it just presumes it's part of CSS's functionality, which is the right way to work when you're a pre-compilation tool. And post-CSS is similar as well, which is great. I really like that about these tools. And it just feels like a perfect setup to me. So that's it for Don't Panic. Let's talk about the thing that I think is also very important, which is communication. So we've got the first key thing, and don't worry, we're not just a quarter way through the talk. You don't have to enjoy me for that much longer. We'll start bringing up the pace a bit now. So naming is hard, right? I think everyone can agree that naming is hard. And let's use the context here for this section of generated CSS class names. And those of you who use Twitter will know that that's how the front end of that site is now built, with generated CSS class names. So naming is only hard, in my opinion, when you don't talk to each other. So do you know how you could get around a naming collision with a component like a human? It's a bit like this. So I've created this imaginary situation for us. And so you got this developer, and she's created this new component. And she says, oh, this component I came up with already exists. Let me have a quick look in Git and see who created it. It was Isabella. And then what she does, she goes and asks a question and says, hey, Isabella, is there a reason why this component is called block, which is a very hyper-simplified name for a component? And then importantly, she'll answer with this. She'll say, oh yeah, it's a very important reason. Now this important reason could be anything that you can think of. It could be an immovable stakeholder decision. It could be a legacy code-based problem, which is very common. Or it could even be a design decision that can't be moved as well. These things are fine and it works, and this is just all part of working in a team. So what she does then, which is important, and this is the professional aspect, is how about you call that component box instead, which is similar to block, and it still works in context. And that's it. That's a great idea, thanks. How awesome was that? It's amazing what happens when we actually just talk to each other, isn't it? Because these so-called soft skills, which I actually prefer to call core skills, are shunned in favor of being able to build your own linked list or to be able to do FizzBuzz on a whiteboard in your interview process. And this really winds me up because to be an effective member of a team, you have to be able to communicate with each other. Whereas the only time you ever have to do FizzBuzz is on that whiteboard in that life-draining interview process that you went through. So it's a waste. It's an absolute waste of skill. So another incredible way to communicate that's not actually talking, I see a couple of faces light up now and I say, oh yeah, talking, I don't want to do that, is documentation. And I love writing, and if you've seen my work on the internet, you probably know that I do a lot of writing, blogging and stuff. And the reason for that is because I write almost everything down, everything I learn, everything I read. I'm always making notes and stuff because it helps me stick things in my brain. It's how I like to commit things to memory. And I also like to make notes of things because I never know when I might need it as well. And there's real value in writing everything down, especially in a large team of front-end developers writing CSS, or even any code, really. You can document your thought process and explain why you made the decisions that you made as well. And it's really handy because when you write documentation like that, when a developer picks up your code, they know what's going on and why it's going on. You can even provide research insights. Like this fantastic example here. This is from a design system in the UK, which is a UK-based energy supplier. And what they do is, in the bottom here, you can see text where they provide research insights as to why they've made certain decisions about the button component. So when someone comes to use the design system, they can see why the button is like it is and the reasons for it, and there's real research that's gone into it. And this is the designer that came up with this concept. She's called Alla, and she's incredibly good. You should definitely go and follow her on Twitter. And she's said here, one of my favorite details on Bulb Energy's new pattern library, research insights that explain rationale behind some of the patterns based on user research. And by documentation as well, I don't mean that you have to write reams and reams of technical text in large format documents. I'm talking about just adding basic comments into your code as well. Take this example here. So we've got a normal selector and it's got background color set to white with an important at the end of it. Now, if I just landed on this in a code base, I'd be like, what the hell is going on here? Why have they just added this important? What's the reason for it? And it puts a negative opinion in your brain straight away. And then judging by the known expressions on a couple of faces out there, you're in agreement. So this is this is what I'm talking about. So this is the exact same code, but the difference this time round is that there's an explainer as to why that decision has been made. So it says when this card is used in the legacy app, there's a collision between existing styles. So unfortunately, we had to go nuclear. It's certainly a refactor target. Now, if I landed on this now, I'd look at it and be like, oh, fair enough, I've got a little bit of spare time today. I might try and work out this specificity issue that they found themselves in. So I've got much more positive attitude towards it as soon as I land on it instead. And these things are real problems in teams because good written communication can prevent unnecessary collisions between people, which can in turn prevent expensive technical debt created by tools. Now that is a win-win in my books. So right, anyway, enough of me yammering on about how to be a function adult for a minute, because I'm this far into a talk about CSS, and I've barely even talked about how you can write CSS like this. So I'll do that now, because I think consistency is key to scaling CSS. Sorry, I said scale again. And really, this is what these over abstractions are trying to do for you, but they just go a little bit too far. So what I do now is I've started working with a methodology that I termed CBUT, which stands for Cascade, Block, Element, Utility, and Token. I know it's a rubbish name, but you know, I'm not here to make cool names up. I'm just using the acronym as it is. So let's go through, and I'll explain how it works and why I do it. So the first thing is the C in CSS stands for cascading, which we all know. And the cascade is actually my favorite part of CSS. And I can see a couple of people wince at the thought of the cascade. Because if you use the cascade right, you can write very little CSS and achieve really good results with it. So let's have a hyper-simplified example. So I've got a body, and I'm saying the font family is going to be Georgia, which is best font. And then the color is going to be goldenrod, because it makes me giggle like a schoolboy every time I write it. And then what I do here is, in this other hyper-simplified example, is I take a button element and I say font inherit. And what that does is it takes the Georgia from the body, and it takes the font size from the body, and it takes all these other attributes in one line of CSS. And then I say color and use the current color named color, which means whatever the cascaded color is in the context, that's what color the button will be. So I want my button text to be the same color as the body text at any given point. And there we have it. Nice, clean CSS, and I'm writing as little as possible and utilizing high-level typography color from the top, which means that I only have to write it once and let it trickle down into the rest of my CSS. So then we move into block. Now, block is your component. It's your card element like that, or it's your button element. These are just blocks. They're a construct. And I don't actually tend to write much CSS in a block. It tends to just be like a container for writing code within. Because then inside the block, I have elements. And elements have a dependency of a block. So an element has to be, in this instance, we've got card image and card body. And the useful thing is, and this is something that I stole from Ben because it's really good, is that you've got double underscore, and then so you can see the block and then the element. So this makes your code really accessible, not just for CSS developers or front-end developers. It also makes your code accessible for people who write JavaScript, who write in HTML, who don't even touch the CSS, because they can see, just by how the classes are structured, what the relationship between elements is, just scanning through it, and it's really, really helpful. So, and inside the elements themselves, I try to write as little CSS as possible and try to keep the sort of specific nature of stuff in there. So inside a card, for example, inside the card body element, I don't actually know what content's going to be in there at any given time. So I need to write CSS that's going to support any type of content. So what I've got here is I've got what's called a lobotomized owl selector. And it's using a combinator as well. So what that selector is basically saying is every direct descendant of body, the siblings, not just the first one, add some margin top of one rem. And you can see in the diagram, I'm only adding the margin to the paragraph and the button, which is pretty handy. So then we've got utilities. And utilities are a class that just do one job, but they do it really well, a bit like a plumber or a tin opener. An example of a utility class is one that might center text, or in this instance, it makes the text bold for us. The simple, low-fidelity tools. And importantly, what that means is you can write common CSS and not have to repeat yourself over and over again in your code. You just apply the utility class instead, in context. So it keeps your CSS package really nice and light and thin. And then finally, we move on to token. Tokens are actually utility classes, but they're usually generated from a design token in a design system. So here I'm applying the brand font, and then I'm saying it's got a text 600. So what brand font is there'll be a design token decision that says the main font is this. And then the text 600 is a reference to a sizing scale. But first I'll explain what a design token is. So I'll let my pal Gina explain what it is. She coined the term design token when she was building the Lightning design system for Salesforce. Basically, a design token is a visual atom of the design system. Specifically, they're named entities that store visual design attributes. We can use them in place of hard-coded values in order to maintain a scalable and consistent visual system. And what this means is that we have a set of design principles and design values, and then we can implement them on the web, in native apps, or in some cases in some design systems that I work on, even in print and in billboard ads and stuff like that. We use the same tokens to power the entire landscape of what our design work does. And so again, so back on that token, that font brand is decided way away from our CSS, but then this utility class is generated to be part of our CSS based on that token value. And I'll show you the sizing scale. So this is off my site. So you can see what I do is I use a major third sizing scale, which gives us this lovely curve between text sizes. And this gives us natural vertical rhythm between elements. And I use this ratio not just for text sizes, but I use it for spacing, and I also use it for inner padding on elements as well. So it means that all of your elements in the UI have this sort of consistency about them. So it's really subtle, but it makes content much easier to consume for the user. It's a traditional design practice that we used to do in print a lot more often. So that's it. That is this methodology that I use. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that this is the best way to write CSS, because it probably isn't in the context that you work in. But the important thing is that it's consistent. And that's what the real magic is. Just like BEM is, or ItCSS, they're just consistent methodologies of writing CSS. And the important thing is to find something that works for you and your team, stick to it, and then document the hell out of it. Enable people in your team to make consistent decisions without slowing them down. And one thing that I will say about methodologies is if you find yourself restricted by one, invest some time into experimenting with something different, because things change, and embrace it, because we work in a very dynamic industry. So there we go. That's why I now use Cboot, because I used to use BEM. I used to use BEM religiously, but I also ran into issues where my modifiers were getting out of hand. I was adding so many modifiers to elements in these massive code bases. And then I realized what all my modifiers were ever doing was setting tokenized values. So that's why I replaced modifiers with utility classes and design tokens instead. And it's helped make my CSS a lot more readable and a lot more scalable as well. Always be open to change. We live in a dynamic world and work in a dynamic industry, just like I said. Because if you stick to your guns too tightly, you're probably going to end up causing more problems, not just for yourself, but for everyone else in the future that has to touch your code. So, it would be wild if I did a talk titled Keeping It Simple with CSS that Scales and didn't talk about simplification, wouldn't it? So let's use the context of frameworks for this part of the talk. Now, the question I often ask now is, in CSS, do you really need a framework anymore? I don't think the answer is yes anymore. So let's use the old whipping boy, Bootstrap, which often gets used in these contexts. But I will say something about Bootstrap. It's an incredibly powerful and well-built framework. It came at a time where we needed it the most, we were learning how to build responsive websites and also fighting compatibility issues with browsers. Remember IE6? What a nightmare that was. So we were doing IE6 fixes and building responsive websites at the same time. It was awful. It was such a horrible time to be writing CSS. And Bootstrap, to its credit, came along and saved us from all of these horrible problems that we were having. And by accident, I think Bootstrap is actually one of the best design systems that's ever been created, because at one point, it basically powered nearly the entire web. You could smell a Bootstrap site from a mile away because it had that consistent 3-column grid, and everyone was using it in the same way, and it was fine because it was serving a purpose for us at the time. But using Bootstrap today, as this image shows, when we have actual native tools for layout, such as grid and flex, we got high support. Remember that bar chart, how close it was to block? It's a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack an egg. It's a bit overkill. We're using a very heavy tool to do a very simple job for us. And the problem with frameworks as well is they can bring complications with them by using like very global selectors to do very powerful design implementations. So we end up with stuff like this in our code, where we're setting importance. So we're going back to where I was talking about before, where you can find yourself creating issues in your own CSS. And the same goes for most CSS frameworks. I know I picked on Bootstrap. It's easy to pick on Bootstrap. But Tailwind Css is another one, which I think is fantastic. And I've used Tailwind to generate design tokens before. I think it's a really cool framework. The only problem is that when you use the default distribution build of Tailwind CSS, it generates 46,860 lines of CSS, which makes me hyperventilate a little bit when I think about it, because that's an incredibly large amount of CSS. For when you import it on your style sheet, nothing will change on you until you start applying the utility classes. But if you have a solid methodology like BEM, it's CSS, SMAX, or even CBut, you know, the one I've just been talking about, you could sprinkle a bit of grid and a bit of flexbox on there. That's your layout sorted, a few helpers, and you're off. You've got yourself a scalable CSS system that's using barely any CSS by default. And this is the thing that myself and Hayden Pickering, he was mentioned in Leonie's talk yesterday as well, we've authored a book together called Every Layout. And what we do in the book is we distill complicated layouts and create this sort of hyper simplification to help you build something that's scalable. So we simplify the problem, we distill it into the simplest possible solution, and we use hints and rules, axioms, rather than micromanaging our browser. So we're not saying do this, do this, do this, do this. We're saying, look, here's some boundaries. Lay out the page how you see fit in this context at any given time, which makes the layouts really scalable for small, large, medium devices in various different powers, screen resolutions, all sorts, all these hyper different situations, because remember, a browser is an incredibly hostile environment for our code to live in. And then finally, this achieves solid, resilient layouts that you can apply across all your projects, and with progressive enhancement in mind, it means it will support really all browsers, really all devices, all the way up to modern devices. And because I'm here today, Moscow, what we've done is we've given a 50% discount code for it using FECRE, which I'll share on Twitter after the talk as well, which means we can get a nice big juicy discount on it. So, enough of that. Let's talk about my favorite subject, progressive enhancement. Don't dismiss modern CSS because you have to support IE11. Now, you see this on Twitter a lot. It's a ridiculous mindset, and it really winds me up when someone shares like a really cool code pen or a really cool layout, and then you can guarantee this guy will pop up in the comments and say, what about IE11 though? Stop trying to pixel push your designs and instead use progressive enhancement to create sensible defaults that automatically improve where support is available. So I'm going to break it down into this really simple, common problem. We've all built one of these, 3-column grid that's got equal spacing between all the elements. Now, in times gone by, we'd probably put some hacks together to make sure that this layout would work in very old browsers and very new browsers. So we might use floats or something like that. But what I propose instead is that we simplify the problem, find a sensible baseline experience, or what I like to call a minimum viable experience, and then implement it. So this is what I think the minimum viable experience is. It's neat stacked boxes that have got a controlled width on them to make sure they don't look silly and bleed out too far. So then this is how we build it. So this is some CSS that I wrote, which is a grid. And you can see there's a link to a code pen there as well. I'll share the slides after the talk. And what this 3 lines of code does is it sets it to display as a grid, and then it uses what's called min-max function to pick the size between either 16 rem, which is the minimum size I want the box to be, and the maximum space, which is 1 fr, which is a fractal unit, which means one piece of space divided by how many items there are. And then finally, I say grid gap 1 rem. So I say just put an equal space between all the elements for me. And that's it. That's the layout sorted. But like I said, we need to implement our sensible minimum viable experience as well. So after that code, because remember, the way that CSS works in its forgiving nature, if a browser doesn't understand that grid code, it'll just ignore it and then carry on working. So then it'll hit this code here, and it'll say, I just realized I pointed at this monitor, and obviously you can't see it, so I'll point at that one instead. So it's a max width 25 rem, so I'm saying that's my sensible max width. And then I'm saying add margin left and margin right auto, so that'll place them into the center. And then I say, with my favorite lobotomized dial selector again, is add margin top of 1 rem. And that gives us that sibling space between all the elements for us. And then finally, to finish our little bit of CSS, we use one of my favorite new features of CSS, which is @supports. And what this does is it says, if you support a CSS grid, then reset these rules for me. So what I'm saying is just remove the max widths and remove the margin from them. So where browsers support grid, they'll pick that first bit of content and then they'll tidy themselves up with this last piece of content. And then what we get, 22 lines of CSS, no hacks, and it works all the way back to IE9, probably IE8, probably maybe even IE6. I just don't dare look at that anymore. I have PTSD from it. There you go. This is it in IE9, in browser stack. It's magic, isn't it? So based on that, this is sort of the last point I'll make of this talk before I part ways. And as I said, slow down. Seriously, slow down. When everything goes wrong in a project, where the deadline's too tight, where everything's getting complicated, slow down. Even when you work in sprint to sprint, playback to playback, retro to retro, you must slow down. And I'll tell you a story, as I became a victim of this earlier in the year. I was working on this massive design system for a cruise company, and to put it lightly, they were probably the most ridiculous client I've ever worked for. They were an absolute nightmare. So they kept making really weird decisions, really odd decisions at crucial times. So what my response, which was wrong, was I just put my head down and just started writing CSS because we had this tight deadline. I was like, I have to just get this system built. But what I should have done is should have stopped. I should have stepped back and thought about what I was doing. But instead I just plowed through, sprint by sprint, playback by playback, kept doing it, kept building it. And it was only when we got towards the end of the project that I realized that we had 2 or 3 different ways of doing a grid. We had some random fluid type system that was fluid based on the viewport and the utility types, which is what I had on the screen earlier. So we had these 2 conflicting with each other. And then we had a card component that was pretty much a website in itself with all the CSS that was crammed into it. And it was a nightmare. So we created all this horrible technical debt. But if I'd have just slowed down and stepped back and thought about it, I probably wouldn't have ended up in that horrible situation. And if I'd employed some tricks like I've showed you today, everything would have been much better. So seriously, slow down and you'll save yourself so much time in the future. And I'll leave you with this message. Instead of moving fast and breaking things, move slowly and deliberately instead. And with that, I thank you very much for my time. Spasiba.
Thank you very much. Please, welcome to our seats. And I'll ask you some questions. First of all, I would like to thank you. Your English is so awesome. It's like a listening exercise for me in English school.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So the first question will be, I think that I will maybe ask two of them in one. What's the next big thing in CSS? What would you like the most?
Oh, container queries, without doubt. Container queries where instead of, so media queries, we're using the screen width or the viewport width and height to make decisions. But in design systems, that doesn't work because we're working in sort of micro components. What a decision we make with a media query in, say, a card might not work in certain contexts. So what a container query does is instead you use the width of the container instead to, say, set the type to be the size and stuff like that. But everyone's digging the heels in, the browsers are digging the heels in about it, and instead they're giving us stupid stuff like styling our scroll bars instead. So one day, when we're lucky, we'll get container queries, and I think I might just retire at that point. I'm a very happy person.
Okay. And what do you think about atomic CSS? It looks like a token in your example.
So atomic CSS is interesting. I think it works when you've got lots of developers that don't write CSS, because you get these tokens and utility classes, just like I said there, and they can be sprinkled on. The problem I have with atomic CSS, though, is, and I've seen this in the real world, is when a junior developer comes along, it's really hard for them to see where the CSS starts and ends and how to even make changes, because a lot of knowledge about the atomic classes is required in order to even make a small change. So say they want to just change the color to blue, they have to work out what the blue token is and how to do it. And yeah, but you know, it works and your mileage may vary. So it's not bad, it's not good. It's just all right.
Okay. How to estimate the performance of CSS selectors? So what advices can you give?
Do you mean in terms of specificity or just how bad they're going to be in the browser? I think, well, I'll answer both. So specificity, there's loads of tools out there that will calculate specificity for you. So a trick that you can take away with you today is if you've got a class and you're struggling to get it to have a higher specificity than anything else, if you just have your class name and then do a square bracket and write the word class, because your element's going to have a class attribute, and then close the square bracket, it'll give you an extra point of specificity. It'll just pop it over the top of anything else. So instead of having to write important, you're just popping it up the context a little bit more. And generating performant classes, if you're class, there's two problems with that. First, it takes the browser quite a while to work out how to work out that CSS, and B, if you're having to write that many classes in a row, maybe your context is a bit too stiff and you need to simplify the problem and the design decision and think back and try and create something simpler instead, just like I was on about then in the talk.
Okay, and maybe you can name some tools that can do it automatically, or?
LinkedIn might be a good way of doing that. So if you're using Sass or PostCSS or something like that, you can calculate how inefficient your selectors are with various packages. So I can't remember any off the top of my head right now, but there's definitely packages out there that are designed to monitor how rigid your CSS is.
Okay, and how do you think, where is the CSS scale limit? What can be next? Is it possible that it will be like CSS for backend or something like that?
So, look, my opinion on CSS is that, and I've done this in the real world, it can power incredibly huge projects as long as you approach it in a similar fashion to what I've just been discussing. So I think the scale of CSS is pretty endless, to be honest. And what people achieve with CSS, not just in building websites and apps, but CSS art, which I know I've got a talk that I'm really looking forward to later about that, and stuff like that, the scales, it's non-existent. I run this newsletter called Piccalilli, which is like CSS newsletter, and the stuff I find for it is just mind-blowing. I've got people doing like hyper-realistic portraits with CSS, and so I think the world is our oyster with it, as long as we respect and appreciate what it does for us.
Okay, and what do you think about naming classes in camel case?
Oh, God, right. I hate it. Right, I love JavaScript and I love writing JavaScript. So I like camel case in JavaScript, but for some reason when I see a CSS class that's camel case, and worse with an uppercase first letter as well, it makes me cringe. I'm all about, and the reason for that is because like HTML attributes where you're applying the CSS classes are dash separated. So it just looks really weird when you're looking at it in context. So yeah, not a fan, sorry, if that's what you do.
Okay, and 2 questions about BEM.
Yeah.
Oh, the first one, what's the core difference, how do you think, between BEM modifiers and your tokens and utilities?
Right, so what I was saying then, I'll give you an example. So button, we all use buttons, we make button components. So I had this big project where we had quite a few different types of buttons. So I'd have a modifier for each different state, and some of the states would be merged as well. So you could have button dash dash red, button dash dash primary, button dash dash ghost, or stuff like that, and it got very repetitive very quickly, and the class was just like this humongous class. But really the only difference was that it was red, it had a transparent background because it was a ghost button, so that could be achieved with just 2 tokens or utility classes instead. So that's how I managed to finally sort of slow down and think about it and think, well, this just doesn't work for me anymore. So it's like BEM, but different is the way to describe it.
Okay, and don't you think that tons of token classes on an element will mess up readability?
Yes, it can do, and I agree with that. What I do to combat that is I do a grouping system. So I use square brackets to group blocks and elements, and then tokens, and then utilities. So when you're scanning through the HTML, you can see what the behaviors are, and it does help. But still, you're adding a lot of classes, so it's something that's unavoidable with these sorts of methodologies. But one thing it does do is you're not repeating yourself as much inside your CSS code, so you're actually deploying a much lighter CSS bundle at the end of it.
Okay, and now please choose the best question.
Oh, blimey, put me on the spot. I think there's one about the limits of CSS, because it gave me an excuse to talk about CSS art, so that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then who was that? The person with the nickname MyWex. Yeah.
Hey.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
And thank you very much.
Well,
and please give some applause one more time to Andy.